how many people, you know, in the United States today are professional progressives, by which I mean that progressive ideology is a requirement of the job that they are in. 10 to 20 million. And, you know, the thing with this sort of Charlie Kirk thing is that one of their big weapons is basically this like good cop, bad cop game where they try to pretend that there's some kind of big difference between a liberal and a communist.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, yeah, no, I just get like, nobody can take that seriously now.
One side fighting to be left alone and just leave me alone movements always lose.
That's right. It's like always been about power, and like you are like very close to like losing all power entirely, and you are going to suffer the fate of the vanquished.
Joined today on the New Founding podcast by two guests. First, we have Curtis Yarvin, an American blogger, political theorist, and software developer. Curtis Yarvin began writing in 2007 at his blog Unqualified Reservation under the pseudonym Mencius Moldbug. More recently, he's been writing in his real name at Gray Mirror, an excellent substack. And then this year, Curtis, your generational run more or less began.
Generational run.
Yeah. You sort of entered the popular consciousness. You had your interview with the New York Times. And
what you're telling me, Nathan, is that I'm overexposed.
Yeah.
I'm dealing with the consequences right now. That's a difficult time.
Yeah. So, and you had obviously there's an associated media effort to paint you as sort of the architect behind Project 2025, Doge, and other Trump efforts. So welcome.
I was accused of being the mastermind behind Bannon in the first Trump administration. I'd never met Bannon. I've still never met Bannon. So, you know, I mean, what are they?
And I'll also welcome our second guest, Ron Dodson. Ron, welcome back to the New Founding podcast, your returning guest. Ron is the CEO and portfolio manager of Dallas North Capital Partners, a private fund management firm. He also frequently writes on geopolitical developments and global risk, including recently for The American Mind, a Claremont Institute publication. Ron also has deep knowledge and passion for the Christian theology and the biblical text. He's done work at the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts, written on Leo Strauss, American Christianity, and more at American Reformer. I also work directly across the hall from Ron Dodson. So we work at the Hightower Dallas workspace. Nice. And I guess I left the office, but the office followed me here. I can't really get rid of you. So welcome both. I want to start actually with the OMB director, Russ Vought, the RIFs that have begun. So OMB director Russ Vought posted on X last Friday, the RIFs have begun. And what he meant there, of course, is...
He didn't put it the other way around. He didn't say, begun, the RIFs have.
No. You weren't there to advise him. Or maybe you were.
We need some more clones. We need some more clones.
So RIFs obviously meaning reduction in force. On Friday alone, OMB announced around 4,000 federal bureaucrat jobs eliminated across various agencies. So Ron, I'll start with you actually. You put out a piece at American Mind last Wednesday where you described this move as, quote, an opportunity to permanently scale back the federal Leviathan. How likely is this to succeed?
Succeed, I mean, what's your definition of success? If it's moving the needle more towards an Article 2 president, which is kind of the theme of what I was writing about. In other words, can you change the minds of folks that just even incrementally that the president has ultimate authority over his executive branch, which he clearly now does not. But if we can move in that direction, I think there is a chance of moving that needle some. Do I think that the RIFs will go the distance necessary to have a true impact, 50, 75% reduction in force? No. I think this first round would take impoundment and Schedule F, that kind of three-pronged deal, and a real change of attitude towards a Hamiltonian presidency. But it was a very good first move, and am I a big fan of Russ Vought and what he's doing? Yes.
Curtis, you put out a piece last week at Gray Mirror. I read it, and you early on in the piece essentially said the second Trump revolution, like the first, is failing. So what do you think about what you see at OMB? Obviously, what we've seen at Doge, what we've seen more broadly.
Sure. Well, the thing, Peter Thiel has this nice line, which is, find the thing that nobody else knows, and I think certainly one candidate for that would be that I have a sense, which I think is not really shared in the administration, that in a way, big things are easier than small things. And so when you look at basically the amount of opposition, just like structural counterattack, the first Trump administration faced when it started off in such an uncertain way, and you look at the amount of pushback the second Trump administration got when it actually, in its sort of shock and awe period, when it hit much harder, you will notice a curious inverse relationship, actually, which shows you that big things are easier than small things. And so when you do a small thing, I sort of disagree with Ron's perspective that a small thing is an incremental step in the direction of a big thing. No, actually, when you do a small thing, that will be the most you can ever do. That defines your limit, and then you're negotiating down from that. And this is why, basically, when I see sort of, these kind of riffs or these, first of all, of course, a riff, it sort of continues, it's, very much within the frame of these sort of completely unconstitutional kind of personnel restrictions where the Congress somehow asserts the right, to control the personnel of the executive branch, which is totally insane. And so, the idea you're doing a reduction in force, like one of the things that I don't know what the specific rules of the RIF are, but I'm very confident that they have seniority rules. They have all this stuff kind of 20th century, government union kind of material. You can probably bump someone with lower seniority than you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The sort of the nadir of this was when they fired probationary employees early in the Doge era, and they were like, wow, there's this category of employees that we can fire sort of without, randomly without cause. But it was extremely random. It was people have received a promotion in the last year, are on the probationary list, right? And so they're basically it's sort of the act of we have this kind of vandalistic intent towards this frankly horrible thing, which is not even an executive branch, it's an administrative branch. It's basically the creature of the legislative and judicial branches. Mm-hmm. And the president sort of sits on top of it the way, Elizabeth II sat on top of, the United Kingdom. And, to actually restore control over that, you really have to assert the unilateral nature of that control. And so if you accept that you're all right, well, this is actually a mixture. So I have executive authority over these people, but they also have to follow the law. Well, what is the law? The law is a stack of papers that would basically fill this room. It has no resemblance to the law, anything that you would call law. It is essentially a set of sort of administrative procedural, dictates for this bureaucracy. And so you're basically, respecting that or you're not. And the thing is, if you decide not to respect it, basically the correct way to sort of think about your mission as you come into power and, to use a Christian metaphor, put on the full armor of God, you're all right, there's three things. There's things this machine is doing and should not be doing. These we can shut down. And these riffs are, to be fair, these riffs are definitely targeted. They're things that he's shooting that should be shot, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I definitely, the metric of how many basically, soldiers of the old regime you've displaced is an important and meaningful metric in any sense of regime change. And we're squarely at 0.01% or something like that, which is pretty solid. Now, Reagan, put up some numbers in RIFs too. The last time RIFs were substantially Hughes in the early 80s, Reagan did some RIFs, and if you look at basically the population, the employee count of the federal government from the 50s through the 80s, it's like you'll see this dip, and it almost goes down, maybe even goes down a little bit in the Reagan era, and then everything else about Reagan is written water. It might as well have never happened, right? And they felt so good about it at the time, and they really felt like they were having a revolution. You go, raising a lot of money, it might as well have never happened, right? And so this is why when I basically look at, the level of power that's being asserted here, I see rhetoric that is, sort of compatible with this idea that you're actually asserting the power of the president as CEO of the government. But the truth is, if you're exerting any kind of power and basically asserting that power, the way to demonstrate that, no, I actually do have this power and I'm not just pretending to have this power, is to exert basically as much power as you can. And so, basically everyone will assume when they look at you, number one, that you're asserting as much power as you can. So that's why whatever you do will not be, oh, it's the first step toward the future. No, it's actually the limit of what you can do. And then you will not now be negotiating that down.
To your point on the limit, the American Federation of Government Employees, which is the union that represents basically the federal bureaucracy,
right,
they filed a lawsuit on the day of the RIFs. And then it becomes basically a battle where you're going from that initial 4,000. You have lawsuits that go on for a year or two. The judiciary is not friendly.
The real question is what the courts will let you do before all this bullshit is resolved, right? But even, the context of oh, this is resolved by a lawsuit is essentially you've already admitted the primacy. You've already admitted the primacy of the judicial branch over the executive branch.
So if you're Russ Vought, what do you do today?
I'm not Russ Vought, so I don't know. I would say, I was advising some English people who were talking about the strange prospect of an election in 2029 in which a party reform that has never yet run an election comes into, office. And it was just look, if you're not completely asserting parliamentary supremacy or in this situation, executive independence, and you're not actually taking over the government, what are you even doing? And they're like, well, we're going to reform this sort of different way of treating this issue and that issue. And I'm like, no, you can't, whatever. Right. And so in a way, but the thing is, I think many more people within the administration are coming to recognize the essentially existential nature of the situation. What they're really bad at doing is communicating it effectively to their voters, because what happens is they communicate in this kind of Rubiconian language, and people hear the Rubiconian language and then they just devalue it. They're like, right. Oh, what he's saying is we need to nuke Washington and restore the Potomac watershed as a cordoned off area, mutant zone, but what he really means is actually we should have a budgetary freeze on the Department of Energy and Commerce, right? And you basically get this situation where you've really polluted the language by talking in these apocalyptic terms while doing fuck all, right? And basically when I look at what's being done, I'm in terms of I understand that when you are in DC and looking through a magnifying glass, you are from the DC perspective, Trump was absolutely right when he was we are going to do things to you that have never been done before. He is doing those things, right? But the thing is, actually, from a historical perspective, it still amounts to fuck all. He's tuned it up by 10x, but it was fuck all. Trump, 45 is 10x Bush.
Yes.
Trump 47 is 10x or maybe even 20x Trump 45. Yes. And realizing that on an absolute scale, you basically your ass is still bumping into the zero line.
That's right.
Is a real wake up call. And my question is essentially how you deliver that wake up call to normies in Frisco, Texas.
Well, what is congressional remedy is impeachment. They're not going to do that.
You're going to impeach. How many impeachment proceedings are you going to have for
That's
all
right.
these judges? Like, it's ridiculous, right?
No, I'm talking about for Trump. In other words, Trump could go to this level and say, and instruct, I don't think this is going to happen, but to take what you're saying is he could instruct OMB, which is the national checkbook, that's all it is, to stop writing checks.
Oh, no. Actually, what he would do would be much greater than that. He would basically say, the same thing that I said to these British people is that you have to basically design a new government and, to the extent possible, you may want to hire members of the old government. This is the same situation that Allied military government in Germany was in 1945. They actually hired a number of technocrats who'd been, involved in the Third Reich. Who are you going to hire, right? But it was basically that was not really, it was a qualification in some ways, but you're just basically all right, what does the federal government of the United States need? Let's stand it up. To a certain extent, its role duplicates things. I mean, there's three kinds of things, right? There are things that the old regime is doing that it should not have been doing. Mm-hmm. Great, kill them. There are things the old regime was not doing that it should have been doing. All right, spin them up. There are things that it was doing but should have been doing differently. All right, spin up, the general approach there is spin up something new and pull in assets of the old thing because you might not want to shut them down entirely.
You raised a really important point about the existential nature of the current political conflict. I mean, I think even being in DC over the past, a few times over the past few months, talking with younger guys in the administration and such, I think many of them underestimate how much risk they're actually at.
Oh, yeah.
On the back end of this administration.
Oh, yeah.
Because Newsom is tacking to the center. And I think that can make some of them feel comfortable. But the reality is that
it's not about politics. It's about bureaucracy.
Yeah, go ahead.
And the reality is that basically, if you believe that our executive branch is an administrative branch and that it actually is governed by the rule of law, then you're basically everyone who, works in this administration is almost in a quasi-judicial position. His job is certainly to follow procedures to the extent that there are procedures that are laid down and he is not following them because he's acting on his own personal whimsy or whatever. He's a criminal. And the thing is, basically, if you think there are not enough lawyers and law students to be basically drummed into look at how hard it is for us to send, God bless this little Kilmar Abrego Garcia. Back to or off to somewhere millions of dollars have been spent on poor Kilmar. Who wants to really get involved? Who's going to make their name? Whose obituary is going to be he's the guy that finally got, Kilmar, to go to the Central African Republic or whatever his next stop is, right? I love that idea. I love it, right?
It's not just nice this time.
On the other side of the coin, however, basically, everyone involved in the lawfare campaign against a relatively small number of Trump administration people did quite well from a career perspective. And so is there going to be a shortage of money to pay these people? Is there going to be a shortage of staff and rabidly loyal staff? Oh, no. Actually, basically, I'm talking to a guy in the administration and he's let's see how the midterms go. I might, if it works out poorly, I might go and do something else because I don't want to be. I'm dude, it's already too late. You have a target on your back. Prepare to spend the rest of your life.
That letter's coming.
Yeah, get ready to spend the rest of your life in legal proceedings, right? And if you think they basically, last time, who got lawfare? 20 to 50 people. Next time it's 2,000 to 5,000. Mm-hmm. If you think they can't scale that shit up, are there not people who want those jobs? Are there not people who are prepared to come up with whatever bullshit at the same level of bullshit they were coming up against Trump? No, you're basically you cannot actually, you've gone, the logic of the Rubicon is once you get your toe a little bit wet, you got to go farther in.
Get your track shoes on.
Get your track shoes on. Do not sit around and fish. Do not wade. Do not frolic. Actually, because you actually cannot afford to lose another election.
Okay.
Like America cannot even afford to really lose the midterms, let alone the next presidency. And we're like fucking around with PR bullshit.
I know you've got an agenda, but hold on.
If you'll excuse me, are you going to bleep some of this material?
This is where I want
This is not a podcast for children. Like this is some serious black pills.
hashtag family show.
Like your 13-year-old will overdose on black pills and like
I don't have a 13-year-old.
I want to go deep. I want to go deep, Curtis.
Yeah.
Here, because this is what I love. Is you're famously monarchist. You and I were reading a lot of the same guys at the same time.
You were reading a lot of these people before me because you were sort of connected to this like 80s, 70s world.
Yeah.
Of like, yeah.
And so, and I have sympathies, very similar sympathies, and where I take it, and I would love your perspective. Here I am, devout Christian guy, but I think this whole idea of rule of law versus rule of man screwed up.
Well, it's just like, here's an analogy, if you will. So I did a couple of debates this year. I did one at Harvard, and which in the spring, and then I did just another at Yale with, Jed Rubenfeld, the Yale, like he's really he's kind of the kingmaker of the conservative Supreme Court, constitutional lawyer, whatever. And I don't think he's really used to being debated from the right. So it was sort of an interesting conversation. The structure didn't allow for enough back and forth, and I did lose in the resulting vote. We lost by like 60-40. But
this is at Yale, though.
Yale.
60-40.
I could not get more than. I could not get more than.
Subtle flex.
I could not get more than 40% of the vote at the Yale Political Union for Ending Democracy. That's true. But I tried, like home field advantage, right? But I knew it would be uphill. But, in any case, one of the things that I observed with both of these people, still more with Daniel Allen, is that sort of, you're debating someone who is not just an academic or a thinker, but an academic politician. And because of that, they have to weigh their words very carefully in ways that I don't. So it's sort of like an MMA bout where I'm basically free to use like Thai kickboxing, but they have to rely on like Tai Chi, right? And I'm like, yeah, I guess Tai Chi is a martial art, but I'm actually going to avoid kicking you in the face too much because it would be ugly, right?
The reality is that they're playing court politics, right? So Professor Allen at Harvard, she wants to run for the Senate or for governor or be the president.
She's already
of
run
Harvard.
for governor,
yes,
right?
Exactly. But if we win, then if we actually win politically, then we get to play court politics. But as it stands right now, we don't have to worry about that.
Because we don't have to worry about that.
Yeah, we haven't won at
basically,
that scale.
I can go old Jean-Claude Van Damme on it, right? And I have to I chose, the thing about a debate, you were not there to make your opponent look bad. You were there to make yourself look good.
Right.
As long as you understand that, you can't go wrong. I did a thing with a truly horrible person, Alistair Campbell, Tony Blair's chief spin doctor. And, I was just like, all right,
Did you Christopher Rufo him?
We had no. Actually, I was like, no. When I deal with someone like that, I basically I'm very non-confrontational. So I said to him at one point, I'm like, Alistair, you and I have something in common. Everyone is like, get him on the Iraq thing because and I was like, you and I have something in common. We both believed in the Iraq War, they don't, obviously this guy is a serious pro. I'm not going to hurt him in a way, but, I'm also not going to let him hurt me.
So back to my question, I think that coming from a Christian perspective, New Covenant affirms the rule of man. It's kind of it's there's a man in heaven, and this and this rule of law dance we play is kind of stuck in this old world. Really old world.
That's true. There's something. The rule of law idea. It's an interesting comparison because the rule of law idea in sort of Anglo-American constitutional history is fundamentally an early Puritan idea. And one of the things that really I was just like, of course, when I learned about where this idea came from historically, is it's sort of most associated. The first man in English history who's a legal scholar who basically says the law is above the king rather than the previous doctrine, which has always been the king is above the law for like very obvious reasons, is Edward Coke, spelled Coke, but actually pronounced Cook, but not like the Koch brothers. It's C-O-K-E. And he's basically writing in the time of James I and Charles I, and he basically he's a legal scholar, and he's like, hey, you know what? I've actually decided that the law, meaning me, is actually above the king, right? And that's sort of associated with the Puritan Revolution against the Stuarts. And one of the things that you see that's notable there is, first of all, the Stuarts come in to power in England, and they're kind of a dry run for the Hanoverians. They're a foreign monarchy. They don't have a local power base. So James I, for example, is always yapping, as the Zoomers say. He's always yapping about the divine right of kings. You know, do you ever hear Henry VIII yapping about the divine right of kings? No, you don't, because he never questions it. He's like, basically that would be for him like talking about how the sky is blue, right? And so James I, being weak, is always like, I'm in charge, I'm in charge, I'm in charge, right? So there's a weakness there, and that weakness gets exploited by basically lawfare. And so one of the interesting things, if you'll talk to like legal historians about this, they'll acknowledge it grudgingly, is a lot of the lawfare of Coke is just plain BS. Like take, for example, Magna Carta. Like Cook digs up this old document from the 13th century. Like nobody in England had heard about Magna Carta or cared about Magna Carta or anything for like centuries. Right? It's as fake as the donation of Constantine. It's like, yes, it's a real thing that actually happened. Okay. Like, yes, it's true. It did happen. But like, you're basically, the other thing that Cook and his peers were like really famous for doing is basically like, they're like, well, in the Saxon Witanagemot of like 950 AD, before the Norman yoke was imposed on us. It's just like complete. It's like, listening to some like, believer, you go to like Hawaii and like you're listening to some like Hawaiian monarchy, national independence thing spout like BS indigenous people's myths, right? This is like basically like Cook stuff is literally like, it's like the Wakanda of like Anglo-Saxon history. Like he's really like trying to Wakanda, Charles I out of, the what was called at the time the royal prerogative, which is basically the same as the Schmittian exception.
I was about to bring up Schmidt.
There you go.
There's theology.
And so, the Tudors basically understand the royal prerogative and just assume they have it. And Elizabeth II, is there a Tudor parliament? Elizabeth II is like, sends notes to parliament like, now let's not concern yourself with affairs of state, like mind you, right? Like she's clearly in charge. There's hints of like a kind of deep state developing, I think in some ways because she's a girl, but like, she doesn't have a natural heir, and James VI of Scotland is just like some guy who speaks in a like weird accent, right? And so actually, like, there's a lot of weakness already developing there. And, this sort of balance of forces kind of like creates this world of like liberal lawfare where they come up with this idea that the law is actually above the king. And once the idea that the law is above the king is visible, like the king is going to lose his head. Like there's no like question of that.
Yeah,
right?
because it's not to get too nerdy, but it's positive law that they're putting above the king. It's not any kind of understanding of natural or...
Sure. And the thing is, you can't really put an understanding in charge. You can put people in charge.
That's right.
And so they basically realize that, like, in a way, like the Stuart monarchs have sort of lost, and this is in a way what you sort of see in the later Stuarts when they try to return to Catholicism, they've lost that sense of being the vicar of God on earth.
Yep.
Right. And government is always, whether it's a communist, the Chinese Communist Party, whatever, like
Every government's a theocracy.
they are all the vicar of God on earth, and they all basically understand that at a certain level, and like are like shit-lib governments are like the vicar of hippie Jesus on earth.
That's right.
And like that's really how they think about themselves.
Is this Sotomayor or who?
Well, I mean, once you become a bureaucrat at a certain level, yeah, more Kagan than Sotomayor. I don't think. I suspect that Sotomayor. It's like there was this interview with like Keir Starmer of England, and they were like Herr Starmer, and they're like, do you dream? And he's like, I never dream. They're like, what music do you like? And he's like, I don't like music. I'm not really sure that justices, Sotomayor or Jackson like dream in any sense, especially not Sotomayor. Justice Kagan definitely dreams.
Can we talk about Antifa? So the Trump administration recently designated them a domestic terror organization.
Which actually has no meaning in law. It's just a press release.
And some people have been talking about designating them as sort of an international terror
foreign organization, which
terror.
Does have a meaning in law.
Yes, that unlocks basically certain levers that can be used against them. In theory. Tell us more about that.
Well, it's an interesting situation because you have this sort of interesting, people talk about a two-tier judicial system, but of course there are like many, many, many tiers. It's like orders of magnitude. And like to get a picture of this, let me start with a distinction that I think most people haven't really recognized, but once you see it, you can't unsee it, which is, since we're talking about foreign terrorist organizations, the difference between Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Now, there's an interesting distinction between Al-Qaeda and ISIS, which is sort of works out in practice. Which is objectively measurable. When people from Al-Qaeda are basically like, bagged and tagged and sent to Guantanamo, in an oubliette, basically all the best lawyers in New York will turn up to defend them. And when you ask all the best lawyers in New York why they will defend these basically like murderous savages, they all give you the same line, which is, oh no, we don't have a brief for Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. Why I lost my second cousin who I didn't actually really like in the towers. But actually we're standing up for the American way. And we believe that everyone deserves competent representation in court. It was, of course, this is a right that was totally invented by the Supreme Court like 60 years ago. But let's let that go. What's interesting is you find this infinity there. Of course, when like January 6th or like James Fields or whatever, is in jail, like these motherfuckers be nowhere to be found. But they also are not found when ISIS is in the dock, as opposed to Al-Qaeda. And what's interesting is that this has, and you're like, why is that? And then you go and read, actually, if you read Osama's speeches, you ever read any Osama speeches? They are just like they're full of progressive propaganda. They have it up. He's always talking about the impoverished of the earth, anti-colonialism, climate change. Like actually, like Osama, who people take as like this, like, is actually like the last in the line of like Arab terrorists that comes from like Yasser Arafat. Like Yasser Arafat's
progressive.
Yes, he's so progressive he had AIDS, and and cheap shot, and
Hashtag family show,
and he's so progressive he got AIDS, and Yasser Arafat, of course, exists as basically the darling of sort of northeastern mainline WASP missionary kind of Christianity in a way. Because that relationship, that Protestant...
he claimed Christianity.
The relationship, whatever you say, like, sure, he's a Christian, okay, he's everything. But the thing is, he's like John Lennon, imagine. And the thing is, the relationship of essentially Unitarian New England post-Puritan Christianity and like the Arab world dates back to the 19th fucking century. It's really old. It's really deep. My great uncle Peter Heath was the provost of American University of Beirut, founded in the 1870s. There was not a trace of Semitic blood, either Arab or Jewish, in Peter Heath. Pure Protestant shit, right? And so actually what you're seeing is that Yasser Arafat had the right ant smell for like the white shoe New York liberal, and that's why pro bono funds, are lavished upon him. And if it wasn't pro bono, like, I'm sure there would have been donors like this.
ISIS,
January 6th, you rot in a hole. ISIS, you rot in a hole. And that's what's interesting about ISIS, which is that ISIS is genuinely like, ISIS is sort of for real at a level. ISIS is this weird mix of like, European second generation super smart Muslims who just go like completely ballistic on the internet, with like the Iraqi security services, with like genuine 7th century Islam. ISIS does not have
eschatological nationalism.
ISIS does not have any connections at Harvard.
Right.
If you try to draw the social graph between ISIS and Harvard, you'll get noise. If you try to draw the social graph between Osama and Harvard, you will not get noise. And that's why basically, really the ugly truth about 9/11 is like, people sort of talk about the right-wing blowback of 9/11, like, oh yeah, we were fighting the Soviets. See, we shouldn't have been fighting the Soviets, but no, it's actually the reason why all of America started waving their flag so broadly after 9/11, liberals included, was they were like, oh shit, they're going to realize that this was actually us. But they pulled one over on us and we didn't realize it. But like, yeah, actually to realize that Osama was like just Yasser Arafat 2.0, like makes you ask the question of like, wow, this guy's super popular at Harvard. Why is that? Right. And in any case, sort of moving forward and out from that, what you see is this enormous disparity between essentially the treatment of like, it's not even two-tier, like ISIS and Al Qaeda are different tiers. Actually, in a way, it might be that ISIS gets better treatment than January 6th.
Oh, probably so.
Probably so.
So how does this relate to Antifa?
So you're actually measuring basically like, here's the treatment of the state's own paramilitary forces who will be let off with a slap on the wrist, whatever they do. Remember the New York lawyers who threw a Molotov cocktail into a cop car? Like if one of those, people does not end up on the Supreme Court, I'll eat my hat, right? And like, I'm serious, right? And so I'm like, actually, what we've realized, or what we should have realized, or what we should have known for approximately the last century, is that there are not two lefts. There have never been two lefts. There's the idea that there is a good cop left and a bad cop left is a lie, and has always been a lie. And like, now anyone with eyes to see it can see, wow, that is completely a lie. It is a completely false idea that there are two lefts. There are not two lefts. Basically, like the level of connection between Antifa and Nancy Pelosi, if you're like measuring the social graph, is just like, come on. Like, a lot of these people are actually, a lot of these sort of trustafarians who are out rioting are actually, like, Tim Kaine's son is, one of this group, right?
Right.
When you basically are like, no, this is actually one thing and not two things, you basically realize that the whole idea of like striking back against Antifa is basically just a Clausewitzian, solecism. You're just like, actually, like, one of the things that every military and political source throughout history will tell you is strike at your enemy's center of gravity. Mm-hmm. If you basically say,
quit playing proxy war.
Quit playing proxy war. And so the thing is, when you look at basically what is actually going on with like ICE and FBI and Antifa or whatever, they're like basically like, they'll go down to Portland and they'll find like two of the rowdiest people who got a little bit rowdy, and they'll be like, all right, we're going to drag you away. And as soon as you're dragged away, Number one, you are a cause célèbre in your community. Everyone will show up for your court hearings. Your lawyers will be free. Your judges will be sympathetic unless you get a bad one, which you can appeal to a good one. You are like running, imagine being Doug Mackey, but like being completely confident that you would get off and everything would be fine. Right. Actually, like Doug Mackey, rolled the dice in a lot of ways. And he's like, I'm going to fight this. And the result is, in our community, Doug Mackey is a hero and a celebrity. But like that was by no means guaranteed.
Right.
Right. For them, it's guaranteed. And so actually, like you were doing the thing, you had this movement that this whole world that got so tired out, was so full of like post-orgasmic like lassitude after the incredible eruptions of 2020. And like, they're so tired, they're so done. And the Trump administration could not, if its goal was to re-energize these people, to wake them up, to bring them back, to make them relevant again, couldn't be doing a better job.
Yeah.
Right. And the thing is, and that's where that mindset of like, oh, it's not enough, but it's an incremental thing. We'll like do this thing. Like actually, like, it's like, I understand where it's coming from. I'm sure that when Russ Vought and his many very competent, based, 150 IQ Zoomer friends look at the government org chart and they're like, yeah, we're going to shoot this, we're going to shoot that. I'm sure they're not firing like randomly. I'm sure they're like, shooting things that really deserve to be shot. I'm sure they are dealing out karma in many, many ways, but they're also like, basically like, I'm just like, man, this is not a game. Like,
they're playing on the opponent's game board.
They're playing within that frame, and by accepting that frame and basically going back to their supporters, they're basically,
They're reifying the current system.
They're supporting, in a way, they're reinforcing the current system in many ways, because they're basically, and they're also grifting, because they're basically saying to the normicons, there's this sort of folie à deux where the normicons are like, oh, surely you can do this because America is like, it's on the right track because it's America. All right, it's gotten a little off track, needs a little nudge. So surely you can do this with 0.01% of absolute power. And like, like my favorite Konstantin Cavafy poem, there are those in them that have the great yes, and those of us that have within us the great no. And the people who have the great yes are like, yeah, vote for me. I can totally do it. Without rocking any boats at all. Like, we'll just pass a thing. We'll have some RIFs. We'll solve the problem, and your sons and daughters will not be castrated and raped and killed. It'll be fine.
So when you think about
and I'm like, I don't know about that.
When you think about the threat to America today, obviously patriots who are serving in the Trump administration face a certain set of, let's say, like potential lawfare against them. But for the average American, you could say there's sort of a set of different threats, right? There's the migrant Deliveroo class, as you've called them, which is just the sort of the flood of third worlder types. Then there's also like the true like Antifa radicals, the people throwing the Molotov cocktails.
Allow me to correct you for a moment, Nathan. Yeah. When you use the word flood, I think this is also a failure of perception. I don't think I wanted to say like you misspelled trickle. Okay, you misspelled trickle because the reality is, if you went to Africa right now and you asked every single, what are there, 2 billion people in Africa, if you asked every single one of them and you said to them, here is a $100 ticket to come to the United States, discount flight, Frontier, Spirit, something,
probably Spirit.
Maybe probably Spirit. There you go. I can just picture that flight, right? And
Carnival cruise.
Carnival cruise, $50, right? More like container cruise, and like, it's a new thing. It's discount cruise, container cruise. You'll know they're there. There's no windows, but you'll know they're there.
So in trouble.
You'll know you're there from, right? Container cruise, right? And like, basically, I think without any trouble, you could get 1 billion people into the country in 4 years.
And that's the flood. Yeah.
That is the flood. Moreover, if you look at the way the flood is carried out, it is carried out in a number of different ways. One of them is, of course, just sort of procedural. But actually, you know, the procedural has a certain strength to it, because if you ask basically any American and say, should your rights as a human being depend on the GPS coordinates where your mother squeezed you out, they would be like, no. And then you would be like, well, that's just a proxy for racism, isn't it? And they'd be like, yeah, I guess it kind of is. And then you'd be like, racism is bad. And then they'd be like, so I hear. And the result will be that basically, you know, here's what will happen if you let the libs back in at all. They will pack the court. They will get a court, you know, majority. And then they will do an American Edict of Caracalla, which essentially says no person is illegal. You can drive around in San Francisco and see that slogan right now. Ninguna persona es ilegal. No person is illegal. We don't care about the GPS coordinates of your mom. What the fuck? Why would anyone care about that? You fucking racist. Okay. And that basically allows us to see, again, like, it's not 2 million a year. It's 20 million or even 200 million a year.
It's as many as the airplanes and ships can carry.
We have
Because
a lot of airplanes.
USA 2.0 is launched with
We
ships.
have a lot of airplanes and ships, and the thing is, you're already seeing that in what used to be called the White Dominions. You're seeing it in of course, with the boats in England. Still more in Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. You're already seeing, basically, in the youngest demographic tiers, you're seeing solid invader majorities.
So why?
Solid invader majorities. And so, you know, essentially, you're just like this idea that the pendulum is going to be swinging back and forth forever. Fuck you. It's fucking bullshit. Like, you need to realize that and wake the fuck up. Right. And so actually, when you're out in like South Dakota, and you're electing like John Thune or whoever the fuck, like, you think that basically they won't be in South Dakota. Oh no.
They will be targeting
You're in South Dakota. If you live in a nice house in South Dakota and you're like a car dealer in South Dakota, you know, will you be a car dealer in South Dakota in 20 years? Probably. And you know what? You will have barbed wire around your house. You will have barbed wire and electric fences around fucking everything, because there will be a favela within basically walking distance of your house. Okay, so this is what you're getting when you vote for Lindsey Graham and John Thune. Let me be super, super clear about that. Right? So effectively, even, you know, and those are Republicans. Oh my God, you get a Democratic majority in 2026?
Well, Republicans in the Spanish sense.
Sure. You know, and like, you know, I saw this phrase once talking about DC, and it included the phrase, something like typical Republican family life or typical Republican romantic life. And I was like, yeah. You know, and I know, and you know, this is all we have, right? You know, this is the last line of like defense, you know, between, you know, that and basically a future that you cannot vote yourself out of. Right.
Why are the progressives doing this? And you've obviously used the metaphor of the cathedral in the past, and Adrian Vermeule has talked a lot about sort of the sacramental nature of modern progressivism and liberalism. So I guess the question is, like, what is the central sacrament for the sort of the elites within the cathedral?
Power. It's just impact. It's, you know, change.
How does this
It's
give them
like
power?
feeling important and feeling relevant. When you basically like feel like when you're destroying something, how does that not give you power? Like, you feel like energized. You're just like, you're ripping something down. You like see one stone upon another. You're like, the bottom stone must be free.
Yeah, you're the agent of entropy.
How are people thinking in America, you know, about, okay, you're a little young for this. Remember the Arab Spring? Mm-hmm. They're like, oh, we're bringing freedom to the Arab world. They're going to have capitalism and libertarianism and social democracy and all of that. And it was just murder. You know, you were just basically standing up and clapping for murder, you know, and like, that was bipartisan. That was the American left and the American right. And they both were like, oh, there's a stone on top of another stone. How exciting to throw the top stone off. Right. You know, yeah, it's just power. It's just, you know, and like, actually the sort of the flip side of that which is really important, is that this is what's really surprising. You see that there's so many of these people, and you lose so much. You're like, how are we gonna are we gonna arrest all these people? We're gonna how many people, in the United States today are professional progressives, by which I mean that progressive ideology is a requirement of the job that they are in. 10 to 20 million. 10 to 20 million. That sound about right?
That sounds about right.
That sounds about right.
Yeah.
So what are you going to do with all these people? Turn them into biodiesel? No. Actually...
Soylent Green?
Soylent Green? No. Actually, it's the same thing that we did with the Nazis after 1945. These are people who are they don't actually believe these things. No one could possibly believe these things. They only believe in power. If you actually take power, they'll just follow you instantly. Mm-hmm. They will instantly support you. But if you basically contend for power in a weak way, they will do their best to fucking kill you.
Do you think you've written a little bit, and we actually went back and forth a while back on this, because you related the Puritan instinct in New England that kind of devolved into this Unitarian liberal mess. Do you think it was the such an emphasis on introspection that turned into a kind of self-loathing that these people are trying to salve?
The spirit, the history of America, the light culture of America is the culture of Harvard. And so, the history of America for almost the last 400 years is the history of Harvard. It's had various enemies. It's triumphed over all of them. None of them has lasted. So you could write a history of Harvard, and that would be a perfectly adequate history of America. The mind of the lib is it's just like the Wittgenstein line that if a lion could talk, you would not understand him. In a way, when I try to understand the lib, and I grew up as a lib, I'm from this culture, right? And yet still actually and I sort of remember early lib moments in a way, and it's sort of like remembering being in love with your ex who you're actually not a fan of at all at the moment, or feel very neutrally toward, depending on the ex, right? And you're just oh yeah, I had that, but actually, what was I doing? And actually, and so even having been a lib yourself, to understand the mind of the lib is just fundamentally and deeply impossible. It's it's an animal mind. It's so, to understand, what are they thinking at Harvard is hard. But, in a way, I think it is this addiction. It is coming from this sort of sense of, emptiness in a way. And you can see that even in the earliest pilgrims. You can see, these were people that were regarded as, nutcases. I wouldn't say they were almost at the level of Aum Shinrikyo, which was also the cult with the sarin in the subways in Japan. Yeah. Aum Shinrikyo was also a high IQ cult. These people were all 130, 140, they were just geniuses they were just sure, we'll make, I guess nuclear weapons are too hard, we'll make sarin. Right. Extremely insane people. And the vibe of the early pilgrims was just it was really intense high weirdness. And so to sort of understand, and they also had this intense desire to feel special, and they were special, and they were very special people in a lot of ways, and liberals are very special in many ways, right? And so that feeling of this sort of need for specialness and this need for distinction and this kind of thirst, in a way, one of the ways to understand the lib is that, do you know Abraham Lincoln's Lyceum speech?
No, I mean,
it's the speeches he makes as a young man. It's a sort of typical, sort of weirdly artificial, forced literary
affectation,
but at a certain level, it like really bites largely because he's really talking about himself. And so, and he is a man of like great and burning ambition. And so when he talks about this phrase, he talks about, the tribe of the lion and the family of the eagle. Maybe it's, the other way around. And he's just like, the essential content of the Lyceum speech is a sort of question of like, how is America going to contain the energy of all of these people that just like thirst for distinction and want to be Napoleon? And ultimately, at a certain level, like every lib wants to be Napoleon and like hasn't really processed what that. He doesn't know anything about Napoleon, but like they want to matter. They send these applications out to college saying, I want to make an impact.
Yeah.
I want to create change. I want to change the world. Like they're just like saying, like that's like a rat basically saying, I want cocaine. I want cocaine. I want more cocaine. And I've never actually done cocaine, but my understanding is that the primary effect of cocaine is that it makes you want more cocaine. Right. And like, that's
many such cases,
right. And so that's sort of like the vibe of these people. And it's like, if you can actually shut down, it's like the case of, there's this sort of famous, like historical narrative of like all of the American soldiers that got addicted to like heroin, morphine, whatever in Vietnam because it was everywhere. And they came back to like Wyoming and this was a blessed time and they just couldn't find opiates. And so they became no longer heroin addicts. And the thing is, that's exactly what happens to Nazis in 1945, believers of, bonsai believers of state Shinto in 1945. You basically cut off their supply completely, and they become sane and tractable. But the thing is, if you cut off like 2% of their supply, that's just going to fucking piss them off. And that's what I would say to Russ Vought. If like, like that's just going to piss them off. And so, in a way, basically like all of these, the Trump administration is sort of caught in this local suboptimal minimum where they're basically sort of subsisting by doing things that, making these ineffectual gestures that not only anger the left, but embolden and strengthen the left. And then they go back to their constituency on the right and they sell that shit. And they're like, we've designated an Antifa as domestic terrorist organization. There's actually no such legal designation.
Yeah.
Right. Moreover, if you designate them as an FGO, which is a legal designation, which has not happened yet, right? But if you do that, you're basically saying, all right, we have all of the legal basis to treat these people like Al-Qaeda. We could be going out there on the streets of Portland, kettling. Do you know what kettling is? Mm-hmm. We could establish a perimeter around all these fuckers. We basically like ship them to a secure facility. We have military tribunals. We were like, all right, who do you know? We basically create a map of their organization that does not exist in order to catch any members who we didn't get in that net. We're like, yeah, if you
and
can,
we follow up the chain. And that's the key part.
Well, there's not even, we follow up the chain to the like legitimate,
who's buying the groceries?
Who's buying the groceries. We also are like, hey, Americans, if you have a friend who was into this stuff and we didn't catch this person for whatever reason, it's Pokemon, it's hard to catch them all, right? It's like, but there's a solid $10,000 check coming your way if you can finger a dude, right? And basically be like, no, actually, like, to make sure that we got every last piece of this network, basically rewards for informants. And basically, so you're doing so. And then, of course, you were following the chain back up, and you will be surprised to find that if you think of this group as the mafia, Rico will let you roll up the mafia. But, the mafia is not really connected to, Microsoft and like Kellogg Brands and like, actually the problem is, and Harvard, and you follow the chain and you're just like, wait a second, this is connected to everything. Now, Whitaker Chambers in Witness actually talks about this. He's basically like, he has this passage, this is sort of a famous passage. It's like, well, of course, he worked for the Communist Party USA, but he's like, there's not really a difference between communism and liberalism. And he's like, yeah, you can pass all these laws against communism, Communist Control Act, Subversive Activities Control Board, amazing logo, at least, amazing mission, didn't actually work, but should have. They were going to register all communist fronts. Now, like, every nonprofit in America is a communist front. Yeah, kind of like FARA. No, every organization in America today is a communist front. Consumers for, against microplastics or whatever, right? Climate change, it's all a communist front by the definition of the Subversive Activities Control Board, right? So the thing is, the idea that you're going to go after Antifa or whatever, already by saying that, you have said, oh, we are not going to go after our opponent's center of gravity.
Right.
And then you're like, we are going to make sure that we shoot their pinky finger off. Yeah. Or and then they're like, oh, but what that's connected to? Oh, there could be a lot of bleeding because that's connected to their heart. Right. But the thing is, if you basically are sort of intimate that, you're like, ooh, we could crawl up the scale and go after so-and-so. I'm just like, no, actually, if you had a policy that was so much of this sort of, stuff with the RIFs or whatever, imagine it's like East Germany. It's 1989, and you're like, the people coming to the streets, they demand change. And, we're going to have stack ranking and 50% layoffs at the Stasi, 20% layoffs, right? If you're not if you're not in the top 4 out of 5 at the Stasi, you're going to be laid off. Furthermore, we're going to tell the Stasi, of course, their mission is to secure the state of East Germany, right, against imperialism, whatever. But now we're going to actually issue a press release that the Stasi is going to respect human rights, right? Or alternatively, it's Germany in 45 and you're like, wow, the Third Reich, bad, we need to reform this. Well, what's the worst problem with the Third Reich? Obviously anti-Semitism, right? Whereas basically the nexus, the heart of anti-Semitism in the Third Reich, obviously the SS. So we're going to strike that very directly. First of all, we're going to have, posters in, every SS workroom about the Jews and how they're good, right? And mandatory Jewish classes for all SS men. You'll learn a little bit of Yiddish, a little bit of Hebrew. It's just no.
I hear they were very Gespakas.
This is not the way that situation was handled at all, right? And say what you want about the way that Allied military government in Germany dealt with the Third Reich. It was, I think, very high-handed. I think it was very cruel in a lot of ways. It was really you'll talk to actual Germans about this. When you look into this, you'll talk to Germans about this and yeah, we know that happened. We don't usually hear that from Americans, but we know that happened, right? And did it work? Oh, yeah, it worked. So why not, instead of doing bullshit that won't work, and it's well, it's a step in the direction of something that won't work, why not start from the other direction and be all right, we know this works. We know that if we basically, for example, one of the things that was done after in 45 was we are going to destroy all books that contain any basically any book that's not essentially a children's novel in the Third Reich that was published between 33 and 45. I do believe that there are copies of these that were all kept in special collections that you need special permits to access. We're going to destroy all the books. We're not going to burn them. It's not a movie. What the hell? No, we're just going to, we are going to literally turn them into toilet paper. Right. And that is the level of authority that was exercised. And, and even in the fall of Eastern Europe in 89-90, much less authority than that is exercised. There's a word they use, lustration. The lustration there was wasn't complete in some ways. And that has caused some real problems since. But still, it's I'm sure Russ Vought is a great guy, but it's 100x, 1,000x what he's ready to do. And the problem is basically, fundamentally with American conservatives, they have not figured out, they are very conscious that they're a democratic force. They are really representing their people. Their people are yeah, wow, it's like this feeling of being like, you're like, you know how sometimes when they do surgery, you'll get like this sort of twilight thing where they're not exactly like a colonoscopy. They won't exactly pull you under, but you're basically on like a lot of like fentanyl and barbiturates. And so, they're like, doing this colonoscopy, and like, you're just like, you feel a little like pressure maybe like back there, something. And, maybe they didn't give you enough fentanyl, and you start to wake up and you're like, wow, that is some really acute pressure, right? And I feel like the Republican voters of America are just like, they're like, wow, why am I feeling the sensation of pressure? And I'm like, well, actually, you're still pretty much under. Like, you would be feeling a much more intense sensation, right? And like, they're actually starting to be like, wow, this is kind of uncomfortable, like, wow, but it's like, you have no idea what's going on, like, sort of behind you, right? You're just like face down on the table, and like, you have no idea what's going on there, and like, there will be blood, right? And like, the to wake people up to that, and to make people feel like the urgency is very great, the time scale is much more intense than you might think, and you are actually very easily going to get into a completely unrecoverable situation if you don't like cut all this fucking bullshit with George Washington and the fucking cherry tree and how a bill becomes a fucking law. Because actually your enemies don't believe in any of this crap. They don't believe in the rule of law. They don't believe in George Washington and his cherry tree. The thing is, one thing, if you'll find a lot of things around that date to early to mid-century, anything involving Jefferson is basically communist, because you had the Jefferson School of Social Science in the 30s. That was the communist university, like CPUSA, whatever. They were like, who was founded really radical and said really good things about the Jacobins, and like, the 1780s that I hope they later regretted. Oh yeah, Jefferson's like, you got to kill them all. We love Jefferson. I don't know why we have a Jefferson memorial, but I'm guessing that was at least half communist energy. Mm-hmm. And do you know the story of the quote on the Jefferson memorial?
Tell me.
If you look at this story.
I don't.
It's a quote from Notes on the State of Virginia. And it's in regards to African Americans. And it says, I believe from memory, it says, nothing is more sure than that these people will be free. But the thing is, it's not the end of the sentence. It's not the end of the sentence. It's not the end of the sentence.
How does the sentence end?
You have the internet, and you have the internet. It's not the end of the sentence. Okay. And so, the thing is, basically all of these sort of bullshit myths that people are attached to, that are basically the chains that are holding them down, are all these weird selective quotations of history. Most Americans don't even understand that the American Revolution is fundamentally a left versus right conflict, and that they're on the left side. No clue. They don't understand that even with the Civil War, or God help me, World War II, right? And so there's just like, you have this sort of mythic, history. It's like there's this fake historical document called the Donation of Constantine, in which basically Constantine allegedly, I think he tells the popes that they're in charge of the world. Totally fake, never happened, discovered in the Renaissance to be like totally false, like was like critical in like the nature of the Holy Roman Empire for like 1,000 years or some such shit, right? And so actually, like, when I hear these people talk about the founders, I'm like, dude, you don't even know the difference between the political vibe of America in 1775 and the political vibe in 1788. And these things are as different as you could possibly imagine. You don't know the difference between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. the Constitution is basically a reactionary coup that's intended to set up, George Washington as a quasi-king. The Declaration of Independence is like, full-on Port Huron statement communist shit, right? I exaggerate, of course. Like, I'm drawing with very bold lines there, but that's basically the difference between these things. Like, you don't even understand that difference. You look at the Civil War, for example.
Well, going back to just what you said, we remind the class that Madison was very much against the Bill of Rights.
Sure. I mean, and Madison is kind of a, he's a going along kind of guy, right? He's not even really a very much a principle, right? Again, all these people have been sort of deified in this weird way. You go to the, Civil War.
Yeah.
There's not one American 100 that could tell you the difference between an abolitionist and an anti-slavery man. The Republicans, of course, are a coalition of these two groups. If you're out west, like Fremont, who, of course, the California, leader, free soil, free men, Fremont, you are an anti-slavery man. What that means is that you're against the South and you're against slavery because you're against black people. This is why the Constitution of the state of Oregon, until I believe the 1970s, barred African Americans from the state. Oh no, they were very convinced. They were very consistent. They were like, the West will be, reserved for free white men at a free white wage, and they were afraid of being undercut economically by gangs of slaves. Not actually ridiculously unreasonable, and their approach was not the slave is a man and a brother, but how are these disgusting people competing with me? They should all be sent back to Africa. That was actually the majority side of the Republican coalition of 1860. The minority side, of course, is abolitionists who think exactly the way, not exactly, but close enough to the way people at Harvard do today. The preponderance of basically the majority of people who actually are against the South because they think it's horrible that the South has brought black people to America is like the majority of the Republican coalition. This is why the North has trouble getting support from England, because English people are like, all right, we understand am I not a man and a brother, but what is this crazy shit, frankly? Like, American white nationalists, literally, the anti-slavery men are basically white nationalists, right? That London is just like, what? I can't even deal with this. This is insane, right? They love the abolitionists. The abolitionists are like 15-20% of the Republican vote. The Emancipation Proclamation comes super late. It's 1864, and it's basically like, oh, we just, as a war measure, we're gonna confiscate the property of the, right? It's sort of, in this mealy-mouthed language, they're kind of trying to appeal to the abolitionists, upper class and to England, but they're also not going to go out and say, hey, black people are just like us, and after the war, they're going to vote in your elections. Right. And, that, of course, goes into the America of Thaddeus Stevens, which is even crazier. I'm really surprised that Broadway has not done a Thaddeus Stevens musical yet. It would be like a sequel to him.
There's still time.
There's still time. I know exactly. I can see the sign. I can see the signage. It would be Thad with an exclamation point, right? And the co-star would be his, mulatto mistress, right, or then cleaning lady, right?
Nathan Lane in drag.
Nathan Lane, yeah. Isn't it? I think he's a little old for the role, but why not make him gay as well? Right? Sure. It's not like Alex, and it's not like Hamilton is a documentary, right? And so, you're actually just you're basically, the real history of this country is this incredibly insane, fucked up thing involving real people doing real shit in ways that are completely incomprehensible to you and would make no sense to you if you were put there in, the world with your stupid ass how a bill becomes a law, sanitized Norman Rockwell American history. Right. And so the thing is, if this is the way you use history, you're basically just using history, first of all, your enemy, the lib, it will just sort of take a weird jumble of things and mix them. He'll just do whatever works, right? But the problem is he doesn't believe in any of this shit. But you do. And that's how basically you're
the hack.
That's how you're being handcuffed. And actually, if you basically just like let go of that and like, I don't believe in history either. Like they're fucked. They have nothing to do. And so actually all of this American traditionalism is the thing that is preventing these people from acting, the great American normicon, bless his soul, with his hot dog church and his revised standard version,
Hey, those are our people, Curtis.
I know. I can't you will not get me the normie Bibles. Don't even start me on normie Bibles. Right. I can't. Right. Right. It's horrible. I realize that there are many mistranslations in the King James, but on the other hand is one of the great literary works of the English language, and the Revised Standard Version is not. So
can we stay on the point of American Christianity here? And Trump had this hilarious line actually yesterday where he was speaking to the press on Air Force One, and I'll read this. He said, "I don't think there's anything that will get me to heaven. I think I'm maybe not heaven bound. I'm not sure I'll be able to make heaven, but I've made life better for a lot of people." And he was sort of smiling while he was saying it. Was very tongue-in-cheek, of course.
Sure.
I'm curious, actually, if both of you, maybe we start with Ron here. Like, what do you think Trump actually believes? Like, what motivates him? What do you think his actual theological positions are?
Well, I mean, he was raised going to Norman Vincent Peale Presbyterian Church, if I remember correctly.
Yes, that's correct.
Which is kind of Presbyterian Church of the Good Idea. I think he's around a lot of these guys. Maybe he's the high-minded way of looking at that, which may or may not be true, is that he's coming to a realization that if there's a standard, he might not personally live up to that. I don't know if that's what he's riffing on or not. I really have no idea. If he's saying that, if he's using it as a way to say, hey, look, great men are sometimes very rough, are purposefully very rough edged. That's kind of where I think he's truly going. Then I think that's a pretty cool point. One of my good friends back home in Dallas is a former SEAL team commander and great guy, but did a lot of bad things to bad men. And I kind of think that's where Trump's going, but I have no, way of knowing. What do you think, Curtis?
I think it's a statement of tremendous enlightenment that basically any spiritual tradition would recognize. I mean, he's simply saying, I'm a sinner. And what could be a more Christian statement, right? Come on, right?
Curtis going the absolute orthodox route.
He's just like, I'm a sinner, and I know that I'm a sinner, and actually that's where I am, that's who I am. And there's this sort of amazing, the thing that everyone misses in Trump is that, behind or even inseparable from this sort of tremendous, this sort of the arrogance of Trump is in a way a kind of cartoon that sort of actually behind it is this immense humility. And I think the humility is actually much more real, and so actually when he says that, he's just if you think of a certain class of preacher whose sincerity you might maybe sometimes question. It's I'm a sinner, right? And he says it with this Sturm und Drang, and Trump is yeah, I'm a sinner. It's actually you're not pretending. You're not pretending. Right? You're a sinner, and actually I'm that is, the thing that is amazing, and this is true of, I believe, both Trump and Vance, is that there's something very remarkable in American political life. These are people who are the same person on camera and off camera.
Yeah.
Who the hell is Kamala Harris or Joe Biden? I can't even tell you, right?
Probably don't want to know.
Like the young Biden, younger Biden, you could sort of see it, but like mostly you can't see it. You're just like, actually, I feel like Gavin Newsom, like somebody just like he lies down on the bed and somebody pulls the battery out and like basically like he's just there until the battery is plugged back in.
Herr Starmer's the ultimate example. The battery truly comes out at night.
The battery truly, he's got a dual battery setup, right? So it doesn't,
Well,
but,
he doesn't
dream.
We saw on the train his little recharge.
Wait, what was this with Starmer?
Oh, so he and the German chancellor or whatever, and they caught him putting away some
Merz. Yeah. All right, right.
I think that the natural follow-up to that question is sort of, Trump comes from, he has some sort of a Christian background, and he has these little lines here or there. It is a little difficult to tell what's pandering to the base versus what's truly authentic, right? It's always difficult to know. But you wrote, I'm going to read two excerpts from your writing. One back all the way in 2008. You were, as part of a broader critique of just sort of like modern rationalism and the rest. You wrote, "I am not a Catholic or even a Christian, but frankly, I think that if I had to vote for a dictator of the world, and the only information I had was whether the candidate was an Orthodox Bayesian or an Orthodox Catholic, I'd go with the latter." And I'll read a second one, and I want you to react to this. In 2013, you wrote, "It strikes me as quite implausible that when our dark age ends and the king's return, if ever, it will be under any banner but the cross." And so
I think that there's a double negative there. I think that basically the idea of like not using that from, it's just like, here's another example of a sort of horseshoe theory place where I think the right, the sort of the atheist take and the kind of the right theistic take, come together, which is that I see in there's a lot of just world theory in the world, and just world theory sort of translates into this kind of debased Christianity where you believe in God, and because you believe in God, you believe God is going to solve your problems for you. Okay, and I believe that
most kind of removal of human agency.
Yeah, and I believe that most really sophisticated theologians have really spoken out very strongly against the idea that God is going to solve your problems for you. But guess what? It doesn't really make any sense to atheists either, right? And and I feel like actually this idea that God is going to do it for us, and America works, and we just got to get on the right track, and and then we can just watch college football, all day.
Grill America,
grill college football. I'm just no, actually, that attitude is really deeply spiritually flawed and leads to your own punishment, and I'm actually sure, it is fine to grill, it is fine to care about those closest to you, and so on and so forth. You have a very serious problem here, and you're ignoring that problem for reasons that are fundamentally sinful.
Yeah.
And basically those sins are really they're kind of deadly sins, right, in a way, because actually you could solve this, and your ancestors are screaming at you, you could solve this, your descendants are screaming at you, you could have solved this, and you're trying to get those hot dogs right, and you're wondering
a sinful level of bourgeois, and
you're wondering if Clemson is going to beat Notre Dame, and you might even be betting on it.
Yeah. So that, for some reason, what struck me in that is, I'm sure you're familiar, whether you've read it or not, Anton's Blue Caesar, Red Caesar motif.
I may even have coined those terms and given them to you.
Okay. Very, very cool. Okay. So just kind of as we have these themes of authority, just authority, and how you've thought about that, riff on, because whether I agree with him or not, I like Michael. I like Mike's writing.
I've lost my. So I had an interesting conversation in Washington around the period of the inaugural, because I'll do office hours, and all kinds of interesting people show up, and none of them so far has tried to kill me, although you never know. But in any case, this person shows up who was basically had been for many years like a high-ranking staffer at a financial regulatory office, and you would recognize his boss's name. And he was not in any way a conservative, and so he sort of had this interesting question where he's like, I can kind of recognize the insights you've had here, but is it like possible, this is like the Ezra Klein abundance thing. I don't know that had come out yet. Is it possible to like apply those, on the other side of the aisle, which is of course the historical American ruling class, so it should be easier. And I was like, let's think about the high-speed train in California for a moment, because I have no doubt that, Gavin Newsom, who is apparently a friend of my old college roommate, Billy Getty, at Brown, I wonder if he remembers my name, but we don't travel in the same circles. But, in any case, my connections to Gavin Newsom are just social graph, are closer than you might think. But, I'm sure he wants to build that train. I'm sure he'd love to, like, if he could snap his fingers tomorrow, he's like, just emerged like a fairy toadstool out of the desert, and I can get on the train in San Francisco, at 11 in the morning, and I can have a late lunch in LA and be back in time for dinner. I did it. It's like it was all covered by tarps. Whoosh, it's there. Gavin Newsom would love to be able to present that. The problem is that most of the work of building that train is not, of course, of laying the rails or building the locomotives or any of that. It's mostly paperwork. And the paperwork is essentially created by various laws passed in the 70s that were basically laws that were, they were there for many purposes, but I'm sure they improved this or that. But their main effect was to sort of feed hippies who needed jobs in like 1977, right? And so you have this stack of paperwork that's nearly end-to-end the distance between SF and LA, and it basically needs to be done in 30 years, 50 years, whatever. And like all these people who are, writing these papers, they need to eat. They have families, they're just like us, and like if you're Gavin Newsom and you basically want to like just build the train, man, all these people are standing in your way and they're your allies. They're your friends. So what are you going to do, like a Mao or Stalin, and like kill them all and like emerge as no, like it just doesn't work, because you have to be coming after most of your friends. You have to become an enemy to your friends. And once you're an enemy to your friends, like you might as well be a Trumpist anyway. Like, go sign up for be like, hey, Donald Trump, I'll give you all the goods, make me Secretary of Transportation. You'd see a new right-wing Gavin Newsom. I don't know, maybe that could work, but why would he even want that guy? If Trump were governor of California, all these people are his enemies. He's just like, yeah, you know what? You better find some other way to eat, because otherwise I suspect your children will grow quite hungry, and they make an awful noise. Children do when they can't get enough to eat. They're really annoying. You think children are annoying? Like, man, when they're hungry, they're really annoying, and when you can't feed them, it's really unfortunate. So you might want to think about what you're doing next, because writing these stupid pieces of paperwork about the diversity of the Fresno snail darter, that is not your future. That is not what we're going to be doing here. So actually, it is much more possible for basically Trump to bring about this abundance agenda than Gavin Newsom. And that structurally is really necessary. So in the past, you certainly see a lot of central, Blue Caesar is FDR. But the thing is, you can't roll that clock back. And that's why sort of this, unfortunately, whatever revolution is needed here needs to come from an uprising of the college football watching, a hot dog grilling American prole who at the moment is starting to become some conscious of the fact that there's this feeling of like real, like sort of pressure, like, right? And it's like, you're still pretty deep under here when you're feeling this pressure, right? And I think if you, it's not like, that's not, if you touch this area,
and the nurse is not a looker.
Yeah, the nurse is not a looker, right? And also it's normal that there's a little blood with these kinds of procedures, but there's there's a lot, and so I'm like, yeah, right, and so actually waking up these people and getting them to act in a collectively effective, optimal way. I mean, it's just like, actually, if you could get the Republicans in California to act effectively, California would be a red state tomorrow.
Yeah.
Right. And that's really what's unfortunate and tragic, is that actually, if people weren't so busy caring about college football, and then behind the college football was in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and then George Washington cut down the cherry tree. And and that's why we have the rule of law. And, I have to, call my daughter they, them, the one state, I think I mentioned this the other night when we were talking, the one state that has moved left in the past 4 years is Utah.
Yeah.
The most conservative American state, because they're kind of a lagging indicator. Mm-hmm. And they're just like, oh yeah, it's actually just being about nice. Who was nice? George Floyd. Who wasn't nice? That horrible, horrible cop who smothered him to death. Purely for shits and giggles, right? Then it's like liberalism is like the smallpox laden blankets. They just don't have any immune system for this garbage out in Utah, right?
There's a bunch of Mormons skiing, and they don't have
exactly. Whereas you go to Yale and you go to Yale and you encounter leftists at Yale, and they're totally cynical about this stuff in the way that Mormon great-great-grandchildren of Brigham Young are not. And because actually when you're part of the ruling class, all of this stuff has become just super stale after 2020. It seems really dated. But in fucking Provo, if you'll excuse my French, can we bleep this stuff? Can we bleep my, it's not appropriate for a Christian, and I feel bad about doing it. But, when you go to Provo, basically, this stuff is still kind of new to them. And they're like, oh yeah, actually, we should be compassionate for what science teaches us about transgender. Meanwhile, the word gender is invented by this New Zealand pedophile in 1960, right? And John Money, the John Money story.
Not specifically.
Oh my fucking God! Just Google the phrase John Money. It's spelled like you think it is, and you're just yeah, I would be he'll be I don't know. It's like watching an ISIS video.
It's like finding out who coined melting pot.
Yeah, it's like finding out the story of Stanley Levison. There's a lot of, I spent a fair amount of time in Europe this summer. I was talking to some Germans, and I was just talking about some of the shit that happened, right? And I'm this sort of post-war Europe that you've created is kind of, it's a little bit like Bluebird's Castle. You're just I got a nice life here, order DoorDash every day. Don't use part of the castle. It's wouldn't really want to eat there. It's this something the drain's a little bit off. Yeah, don't open that door. And it's first of all, there's nothing you want to see behind the door. Secondly, the door is marked, owner only. Why are you there, right? Right. And so actually, there's a sort of whole very Bluebeard's Castle aspect related to the whole 20th century in a way. You have all these sort of Marvel myths. Conservatives have their Marvel movie, 18th century, 19th century, whatever. It's just actually, if you did not know anything about history, you would be in a better epistemic position than that, right? Of course, for the libs, it's the 20th century, and again, I'm just actually like, I said this to Sean McMeekin, actually. I was like, I don't think a good, who's one of the great historians of our time, a very prolific, amazing guy. And I was like, yeah, I don't think really a good history of the 20th century has been written. He's like, yeah, I'm working on one, but I think you're right about that, And I'm like, that's actually like, when you're just like, where do I live? What is going on? Where am I in time? Like, you're actually like, that's how confused everyone is about where they are. And if you think, oh, there's two parties and they disagree with each other, maybe on some issues one is right, maybe on some issues the other is right. I'm just like, first of all, you have to consider the possibility that they're both wrong. Secondly, when you sort of look at these two sides, what they should remind you of is, everybody knows this couple where, they're fighting all the time, and they're just like, like the problem is like she's really right about him, but like he also is right about her, right? And that's kind of the situation that we're in with, the sort of aristocratic meritocracy versus like populism being like literal democracy, meritocracy being like George Soros democracy. The reality is they're both really not satisfactory as ways to govern a country. And
well, I love your talk.
And they have very, very acute critiques of each
everybody
other.
loves democracy, everybody hates politics.
I know. And I'm just like, actually, like, that's why it's such a conundrum that there are only two forms of government, like oligarchy. Oh wait, there's a third. There is. And strangely, the third is the one that like everybody has used for almost all periods of human society. And like,
even businesses.
And even you go to a movie, it has a director. You go
it
to a
does.
restaurant, it has
the
a
best
chef.
ones are absolute monarchies. Kubrick wasn't taking notes from the studio.
Oh, no. There's a rule. One of the things they say in Hollywood is if you're directing a film, one of the most important things, it's what we call in the Silicon Valley world stack ranking, fire someone on the first day. Whoever is basically like, if everybody is an A+ and there's some guy who's an A, he's fucking done, and that's how you keep them in an A+. And like, that's a wonderful situation. Does this guy deserve to be fired for being merely an A? Yeah, actually he does, because he's in the wrong place.
Yeah, this is Jack Welch, GE.
Yeah, exactly.
He was
exactly. And so like, of course, as one of the things I do, especially with libs, is I'll basically pull my phone out of my pocket and I'll basically be like, if you look at the box that this phone comes in, it says designed by Apple in California, assembled in China. Okay, that is two monarchies and two one-party states. Right. And if you try to imagine this, Sacramento either designing an iPhone or assembling an iPhone, you have to be like, right, and yet it's not the condition of being in one party state, because that applies to both China and California. And like, what's the variable here, right?
Yeah, if we come back to the point on democracy being good and politics being bad, the Obama Foundation put out a video just the past week where Obama said that he and his team are working on strengthening democracy in Poland and Hungary, right? And
they strengthened democracy so much that they actually pulled the opposition TV station off the air. They yanked the plug on it as soon as they had power.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, obviously, appreciating your work, I immediately read that and was thinking like, oh, okay, that's basically sort of flowery progressive language for like we're supporting a regime change in Hungary.
These are serious people. Well, it hasn't happened yet, and let's pray it does not happen. But you can be guaranteed that if they do win the election in Hungary, like everything Orban created is going to vanish within a week, because these are serious people.
Very serious.
Very serious.
Well, look
people.
what Samantha Power was trying to do. During the Biden administration with Orban in every way possible, trying to undermine, and that's a U.S. You know,
Oh, absolutely. Oh, absolutely. That's the way, you know, you know, my father had this wonderful term for the classic State Department technique in this, when you can't just push someone over directly, which is not taking yes for an answer. So, you know, Kissinger will go to, say, Victor Vorster in South Africa and basically be like, you know, I know how difficult it is to operate in this part of the world. Like, nobody understands you, but I understand you. I'm really on your side. You know, we're fighting communism together. Like, it's actually, like, it's really an honor to be here with you, Mr. Prime Minister. And, you know, and I have to go back to Washington and, like, you know, and fight for you there. And, you know, people just don't understand. It's a difficult environment. So, you know, and I thought of, like, you know, well, here's a thing you could do that's like a small thing that, like, doesn't really matter much to you, but, like, it's just, you know, symbolic, but it would mean so much, you know, it would really help me out in DC. And so, you know, Vorster would give him this thing, and he's like, oh my God, thank you so much. I knew you would understand. He flies off, he does the thing. 6 months later, he comes back and he's like, you know, I really appreciate you for giving that. We're really on the same team. Like, we're really together. It's just like, you know, and I feel I get down sometimes because of, you know, how hard it is to fight for what's right. And then I remember how strong you are in standing up for that. And, you know, and I'm heartened, and I'm just like, it's so good working with you. Now, you know, these people are just really, they're just impossible. Like, I mean, oh my God, like, you know, I really appreciate it. It's really helped. But if you know, if you could give me this other thing, like, you know, and that's not taking yes for an answer, right? And eventually you look in your pocket and you find your wallet isn't there anymore, and, like, you don't even have keys to your house, right? Because they've taken everything. And that's basically how, like, when you're not able to sort of resist that, that's sort of what happens to you. And that's why, like, you know, just weakness creates more weakness, and strength creates more strength. And actually, you know, you're seeing all of this. Like, one of the weaknesses of the lib is that there's no central control. There's no one who's in charge there at all. There are, you know, networks of power, et cetera, et cetera. But the result is that they'll do things that they just shouldn't do, and they'll behave in, like, ineffective ways. Like, it was clearly the right thing if the Democrats had had a central authority. They would have, like, worked harder to get, like, say, this guy in Virginia, Jay Jones. They would have been like, yeah, no, we don't, like, your reliability, whatever we can get out of having you as Attorney General of Virginia, is wildly dwarfed by, like, the cost to you in PR. They can't do that. They actually are not structurally capable of doing that. That's a huge, in a way, tactical advantage, because it means that you can sort of, they're basically like, and you know, the thing with this sort of Charlie Kirk thing is that one of their big weapons is basically this, like, good cop, bad cop game, where they try to pretend that there's some kind of big difference between a liberal and a communist.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, yeah, no, I just get, like, nobody can take that seriously now.
No,
and
the diversity on the right is an order of magnitude greater than
the right is just, the right is not even a thing. The right is just an absence of the left. The left is basically united by a kind of shared, it's like, you know, it's funny, I was talking to an Uber driver once, you know, an actual American, and this person was like, had done some work as a drug counselor or something like that, and I was talking about the world of, like, you know, the homeless, like the, you know, the San Francisco equivalent of LA Skid Row, and I learned something interesting, which is that actually these people segregate each other by drug. So the meth heads and the, like, fentanyl addicts will basically not, like, they'll, like, form, like, little territories. It's like they're like a race almost, like, you know, the brown cafeteria or something. Like, they will not, like, hang together, right? You know, and I was just like, wow, you know, that's, but the thing is, you know, of course, for rightists, essentially, like, you know, just as sort of addiction is in a way kind of the shared absence of sobriety, like the right is essentially the absence of left. And so we disagree with each other about everything. You know, in a way, one of the things, if you remember my discourse about ISIS is sort of truly a neo-reactionary operation. They're neo-reactionary in a very different sense than me. They have very different values, but
their teleology is different.
Their telos is different. They're Muslims and I'm not, and there's a number of other differences. I mean, their sense of cinema is, you know, but you know, you know, that said, the thing is basically they're people who don't believe in like the 20th century powers that be, and neither do I. We've just drawn very different, you know, sort of pictures on where you go from there. You know, whereas the left is basically the set of people that are responding to the same incentives. They're all basically drawn in the same direction. They are all basically power addicts of one type or another. And so they just like naturally collaborate very effectively because they're kind of operating in a kind of shared power field. This is why, you know, you hardly ever see defections in among the Democrats in the House or Senate now. Sometimes it would be like sort of allowable, but like if something, you know, really matters, frickin' unanimous, because they are basically profoundly self-organized. That doesn't work for us automatically. We need to actually build structures and tools to do it.
But the left is like a school of fish kind of
That's
organized.
Right. That's right.
It's not under a unified head.
There's no kingfish at the head of it. They're just responding to the same like changes in water. You know, for example, you know, the greatest example of like, you know, I always used to be when I read like 1984, I'm like, yeah, wow, this could happen. And then you get to the end where they're like, we've always been at war with East Asia. And I'm like, no, because you're just, you know, George, you're just laying it on a little thick here. Like, people don't do that. And then, you know, came the greatest version of that I hope we'll ever see in our lifetimes. It was at the end of February 2020 when Donald Trump decided to be a COVID dove.
Yeah.
Instead of, as everyone expected, a COVID hawk. And the result was that everyone in lib world, whether experts, non-experts, had been telling you for a month and a half that there was no COVID. If there was, it was not a thing. And if you thought it was a thing, you were a racist. And really what you should do is go to Chinatown and lick doorknobs. And suddenly, when Donald Trump zigged instead of zagging, they were like, we must protect our precious bodily fluids. And they just went all the way right in the other direction. And you're just like, wow, you know, actually your positions, your ideas, they're no positions, they're no ideas. There's just power. Like, power one day can tell you to be a blood and soil nationalist, and you can be singing your land acknowledgements and, like, you know, Slava Ukraini. And then tomorrow you're back to, like, you know, singing along with John Lennon Imagine as you go through Disney It's a Small World After All ride.
Yeah, I mean, to use the school of fish analogy, essentially with the school of fish, you just see like a massive shark to show up and they will all respond to that together.
Yeah.
And instead of, again, you could say that maybe many of the current measures have been sort of, you know, picking out 5% of the fish, you know, sort of one at a time. You need a much stronger
force. If you look at this school of fish and you see it swimming north, and you think, oh wow, you know what unites these fish is northism, right? And then the shark, you know, goes around to the north, and they're like, no, they're actually southists. And I'm like, no, actually, they're a school of fish. And if you understand them through that lens of like their issues or ideas or whatever, like, how many times have we seen these people flip, you know, 180 degrees on that? They instantly adopt whatever is the most powerful. The rightist actually believes what he believes in.
Yeah.
It's suicidal, right? You know, and like,
do you think somebody like, even, I mentioned Obama earlier, do you think that he knows that we are past the era of sort of the norms and the term limits and all of the rest.
Dude, they've been past the norms. They've been past the norms for almost a century.
I mean, it's interesting.
Like, they don't actually believe in any of this stuff. They did not believe in it under FDR. They never believed in it.
So is somebody like Obama personally ambitious for more political power? I mean, he's still fairly young, and he's putting out these slick videos and the rest.
I don't know what's going on through. Like you're anthropomorphizing, right? You know, like, you can't actually, like, you know, you can't anthropomorphize these people and react as if they were sort of human at a certain level. Like, that's just going too far. Like, biologically, that's correct, but, like, basically, like,
spiritually,
like, don't project onto them, right? You know, like, I'm serious. Like, anthropomorphizing them is sort of really bad, right? And so they have this.
You might feel some empathy.
Yeah, no. Are you familiar with a book called Paralandra? You know, if you're tempted to feel any empathy, you should read Paralandra again, and then be like, yeah, no, actually, like, this is not my old friend, you know, and, like, you know, yeah, no, actually, like, you know, in a way, I mean, there are ways in which people have misinterpreted Tolkien, but, you know, the image of the ring wraith as sort of someone, like, entirely consumed by a certain kind of lust for power is just, like, that's actually how you have to regard these people. And you can imagine a world in which the ring wraiths are, like, subdued, stripped of their rings, and then they have to go and, like, go through, like, some kind of halfway house program where they, like, work at Starbucks or something, you know, and, like, learn to, like, you know, be normal. And, you know, you can't be at Starbucks and go, right, you know, and if you would, you don't even have the ring anymore, so it doesn't work. Like, you know, like, chill out into that again.
I'm trying to think of a right-wing Starbucks and what that would be.
Well, I mean, Chick-fil-A, right?
There you go.
Yeah, there you go.
Perfect.
In and out, you know, and, like, yeah. So like that feeling of basically when you're looking at these people, sort of all you see is the power, and if the power, like, crumbles away, like, they have no organ, they're just nothing. They'll follow you instantly. They will actually they're used to following the biggest source of power around them. You know, I forget who said the public is a woman. Like, could have been Hitler, but, you know, if it was Hitler, he was right. But, you know, Hitler was wrong about a lot of other things. But the public is a woman. And sort of when you basically, the big flaw of sort of normie-con politicians and normie-con media leaders is that they follow the public that they should be leading.
Oh, that's so good.
It's so bad. It's so, like, the wrong thing. And, like, actually, no, I believe that these people are actually genuinely human beings who are capable of being led and basically
want to be led. Honestly.
And want to be led. And when you ask them, like, what issues they care about, like, they're almost like, oh, I got to make up something. But actually, they just care about, like, you know, they have this feeling of impending doom.
Right.
And they care most about reversing that feeling of impending doom. And they know in a way that that feeling of doom is, like, accurate.
Every time they go into a Costco or whatever,
they know they're right.
They feel it's, yeah.
They know that there's, like, something really deeply wrong here. And, like, actually, they need to be led in a way that will make their political action genuinely effective in saving them from this basically monster, which they don't really understand, and, like, but is, like, absolutely, like, real, and in many ways, like, realer than they even think.
And that's the message that the to quote Aristotle, that the statesman needs to communicate is this is bigger even than you think.
This is so much bigger.
This is existential.
This is so much bigger than, like, basically, should men be allowed to play on women's sports teams? Like,
yeah,
that's a symptom. Okay, you should not ignore these symptoms. Symptoms are important, but basically, like, let's say you have, God forbid, colon cancer. The problem is not that you're like crapping blood and that your underwear get a little stained.
I see a theme going on here.
You know, the problem is like, I'm sorry, I want to
recent appointment. Or
I want to hit people. No, but I didn't want. You know, I want to hit people in a very visceral sense, literally. And I'm like, basically, like, no, actually, the problem is not the symptoms. The symptoms show you that you have a problem that you need to very deeply understand.
Can you paint the picture for us more practically? I guess moving away from the medical sort of metaphors, like what does this actually look like if we lose?
I think the most simple thing that it looks like is basically all of the sort of infrastructure of power and all of the kind of rebellious structures that have been built up, all the people involved in this basically get personally destroyed to within the limits of the possible. Probably will be a little stochastic. So first of all, if you were involved in the Trump administration in any way or supportive of it, you definitely need to figure out how you are going to get out of the country before 2029. Number one. That is a plan you were going to need. Number two, if you were not associated with basically these structures, you are going to basically, you need to realize that you are going to live in a third world country. You need to understand what living in a third world country, looks like. You need to basically organize your investments, your family, your real estate portfolio.
Go study Joe Bird.
Such that you will be, if you go, for example, to the best areas in Sao Paulo, right? You will see that the best areas in Sao Paulo look a lot like Beverly Hills, but with a lot more electric fencing. And you're going to need that. And you're going to need a lot of money to basically afford to live in a kind of safe way in this environment. So if you basically, are going to put your faith not in the right political outcome, which is, of course, not up to you, but just to defend yourself personally, think gated communities, because you are going to see hundreds of millions of third world people basically brought to North America. Anywhere you're driving along a beautiful bucolic freeway and you see a kind of flattish area of ground, there's going to be a squatter camp there. Big country. Could fit a lot of these people. There will still be a lot of unspoiled, empty places, and then you'll be driving around a bend in Yellowstone and you'll be like, yep, Angolans. And the water is not going to be clean because Angolans have bodily needs, right? As do we all. Right. And so, that's basically the reality that you need to picture. The idea that the game of politics has sort of been a game since 1776 or 1789 or Magna Carta or whatever crap you come up with. No, it's always been about power, and you are very close to losing all power entirely, and you are going to suffer the fate of the vanquished. And moreover, for example, when you look at basically how did the libs even get power in the 20th century? Well, the two constituencies, say what you want about them, neither of them is perfect in any way, but the two constituencies that were the voting bloc that kept basically President for Life, Blue Caesar, Franklin Delano Roosevelt in power were number one, the Solid South, and number two, the inner city Catholics. And as for the Solid South, most people probably know what that is. And they're like, oh, yeah, they were Robert E. Lee was a Democrat. And so the Democrat Party is good enough for me if it's good enough for Robert E. Lee. Many Southerners continued thinking that into the 1970s. Okay.
In Texas, late 70s.
I'm just saying that basically there's being cucked and there's being generationally cucked. This is multi-generational cuckoldry, right? Because that actually made the somewhat moribund Democratic Party a very attractive candidate to take over, because you would have all of these people instinctively voting for you. It's like the way certain kinds of parasites will go into the ant hive by putting on the right ant smell, but they're not even ants. They're actually moth larvae, and they eat ants.
My granddad was born in 1903, very what we would consider sociologically based guy, fireman, very masculine. always voted Democrat.
Of course you did. Of course you did.
Until Carter said gave the Playboy interview. But
wow, it was the killer rabbit that stopped it, right? And so and the second group that voted for FDR were the inner city Catholics, and you're just like, inner city what? And I'm like, exactly. Right. Actually, they got so completely hosed that actually you can't even define that ethnic group in a way anymore. They got completely owned. Right. And so, that pattern of basically being owned, I mean, the idea that you have some kind of competitive democracy after 1940 when FDR runs a Democrat on the Republican ticket is like really? And then in 48 and 52 again, Eisenhower is spoken of as a Democratic candidate in 48. Oh yeah.
He was recruited by both parties.
He's a New Deal general, not even both parties. He's a loyal member of the whatever. So you're just politics is over, right? And so it's over, it's done. Yeah. It's not a thing.
Fukuyama.
And so you basically have actually before you slide down, the Mamdani slide into basically universal third worldism, which if it doesn't have a third world is going to create a third world.
Right.
Right. You basically have a very, very short window of basically for decisive action. So keep that in mind when you're doing press releases and issuing challenge coins, because some ICE people had a brawl with some trustafarian in Portland. Okay, basically, do you know how many orders of magnitude you are away from that to basically we're gonna zero George Soros's bank balance? Oh wait, I forgot, that's a violation of private property rights. We can't do that. We have to respect that. Have you heard of a guy named Massey? He's very principled. And sorry. And I like the guy in a certain sense. I'm just basically you need something that's you know what we need? We need Ozempic, but for autism. Just universal cure for libertarianism, FDA orphan drug status. Yeah. They're yes, we're going to Operation Warp Speed, we're going to cure political autism and patient zero is going to be Representative Massey. And we're just going to have to hold him down. And then when he wakes up, he'll be just profoundly based.
I'd love to.
How do you want to land the plane?
Yeah, I was going to say, I would love to end this by actually shifting to something a little bit more practical, which I think you've done a really excellent job of painting a picture of basically how severe the crisis is. Yeah. And I think it's very clear also, if you're somebody in the Trump administration, sort of what the stakes are, right? Yeah. But I'd say most of the people who listen to the New Founding podcast, right, these are usually people who are founders or investors or working in startups or whatever else.
Cortez move of burning your boats.
So what I would ask is, let's say that there's a 25, 27-year-old person, maybe they have a right-wing Anon account, and they're kind of in some right of center circles, they go to church, whatever else. What practically should they be doing over the next few years in order to help us win? And then also, if we don't, what should they be thinking about? I'd love if you could just speak to that directly.
They should win personally. And actually, really, I can't, in good conscience advise a young person to do anything else than, number one, save your soul and your honor, and number two, win personally. And actually, sometimes those things come into conflict with each other a little bit. You've got to recognize and understand that we don't live in a just world. We live in a we don't live
fallen.
We live in a real and fallen world. And actually, the presence and the reality of sin is clearly a part of God's plan, and so you have to be sensitive to that, but also frickin' succeed and actually win. And the more you win, the more you will be capable of being useful in a world in which your talents are actually needed. And one of the amazing things, this is sort of one of the ways in which LARPing is we're going to be the left in the other direction. Joseph de Maistre, who's amazing, has this line where he's the counter-revolution is not revolution in the opposite direction. It's the opposite of revolution. So when you take this kind of Gramscian approach, in a way, you're thinking like, oh, revolution in the opposite direction. It's not really like that at all. Actually, one of the most inspiring sort of historical analogies that I have, and this is one that people like Saurabh Sharma and American Moment, I think, would do well to understand, is that when Napoleon, who's one of my favorite recent, world leaders at least, sort of takes a unilateral plenary. I think Stephen Miller used the word plenary recently, which gave me some hope. It's a good word, plenary. It's a very innocent word. When Napoleon sort of took plenary control, he had a policy of, I'm not going to butcher the French, the career open to talents. And what he realized is that he had so completely defeated ideology in France that his organization was so sort of completely top down. He didn't actually care about the ideology of the people he hired. Because in Napoleon's France, personnel was not policy. Policy was policy. Actually, Napoleon was policy. It's like if you're running a software company and you'll have, different people have different opinions about programming languages, right? Happens all the editors, but languages, whatever. But, the thing is, if you're actually capable of saying, all right, we're doing this in JavaScript, how good are you at JavaScript? Nobody's going to be like, well, we can use Haskell that compiles to JavaScript, right? And actually just basically saying, you're going to follow me and work for me in a sort of hierarchical structure with mission orders from the top down. That's sort of a miracle and a revelation. And in a way, one of the things that, and I always say this to libertarians, the most effective engineering project of the 20th century is clearly Los Alamos. That's part of the government. The Manhattan Project has actually evolved into the Department of Energy, which is one of the, my mother worked there. It's not one of the most efficient, organizations in the federal government. Things age, but in its youth, it was the Manhattan Project. It was a startup. It was run like a startup, right down to the two co-founders, one technical, one non-technical.
NASA.
And it's a slightly different story. That involves Nazis. The N in NASA is really Nazi, but sure, but Los Alamos is pretty effective. And one of the most amazing things about Los Alamos was that they took guys who were at the top of their fields and they told them what to do. This never happens to scientists now. If you're a really successful scientist, scientific bureaucrat, you've been writing your own tickets since you were 15 years old and working on a science fair project. Instead, Los Alamos is oh, hey, von Neumann, why don't you go figure out the fluid dynamics of compressed plutonium? Does von Neumann have any interest in compressed plutonium? No, but he actually is a soldier in the cause, and so he goes and figures it out. And there's one thing that, and that created this just incredible effect of where you had the best people in the world and they weren't being prima donnas. And oh my God, as a technology company person in America, I myself am a sinner. I can be a prima donna, but the prima donnas are so bad. There was this thing that happened recently. There's this sort of great Bloomberg story where a bunch of American investors were maybe we need our own supply chains for things like batteries. Could we fund Western European American battery companies? Wasn't that a good idea? Why don't we go to China and look at how they make batteries? And they go to China and they look at how they make batteries and they're let's maybe find something else to invest in. I swear. And one of the lines they had, and this one really resonated with me. So it's very late in the day, right? And one of the lines they had, and this really resonated with me from my own, utterly cursed professional experience, was they're in China, the technology people are let's do something stupid and make it work and then do something smart. And the Americans are let's do something smart. And, like when you look at sort of where we still have this kind of spectacular brain power in a way, and you look at the ways, all of the ways that we're wasting this, right? And, they're in a way, they're summarized by a conversation I had, just the arrogance and the malinvestment, as an Austrian economist would say. I had this big party like 3 months ago or something, and I'm not sure if this guy showed up or not. That is too big a party. But I'm walking on the streets of Berkeley, California, and somebody recognizes me, which happens it's really weird, uncomfortable thing. But it's okay. It's almost never negative. This guy was positive, and so he's like, and I'm like, what do you do? And he's like, I work on quantum computing. And I'm like, oh, do you work at X firm? Because I know that X firm is in the East Bay, right? And I'm like, he's like, yeah, I'm at X firm. And I'm like, is quantum computing ever going to work? He's like, and I'm like, all right, I know what you're thinking. This is what's going on with quantum computing. You're working hard there every day at your well-funded quantum computing company, which has gotten a lot of great press, and there's a lot of different problems to solve. It's really hard to make quantum computing real. And let's say there's a bunch of problems that you could work on, and they're all hard, cool, interesting problems that you can make progress on every day. And out of 10 problems that you need to solve to make it real, 7 of them are like this, and the other 3 are you have no idea what the hell you do about them. And you're and what you're doing is you're just focusing on the 7 problems, and with the other 3, you're just yeah, and at some point that will become relevant. And he's like, yeah, basically. And there's so much of that. There's so much of people basically, even in industry, even in real venture funded things, not big tech, real, the stuff that's supposed to be so responsive to incentives, so dynamic, so Hayekian. There's a ton of stuff where people are just oh yeah, I know there's this one fact that renders everything I'm doing useless, but I'm just not.
I've got a checklist.
I'm just not going to think about it. And then you become basically, and this sort of goes along with something that I discovered that really disturbed me the first time I started raising funding in Silicon Valley, which is that I realized that basically venture capitalists don't do technology due diligence. And the reason why they don't do technology due diligence is that they realize that it would just be going into the briar patch after Brer Rabbit, right? There is no one but a scientist who is capable of fooling you better. He's going to say, yeah, we have 7 problems to solve, and we're kicking ass on all of them. And unless you know the other 3 that he has no idea what to do with, you'll have no clue of that. And are you a quantum physicist? No, you're a generalist. You would never see those other 3 things. Basically, he's just going to own you. So the only way to deal with that is to basically, instead of investing on the basis of does this guy's, math and engineering check out, invest on the basis of does he have the right vibe? That level of even with our core Silicon Valley, our best engineering culture is really problematic in very, very deep levels. And that is how up shit creek we are.
Yeah.
Right. And forget fentanyl, Skid Row, rotting Ohio, this country has been hollowed out. It's a wasteland. Right. But even the best aspects of it basically, in a lot of ways, need an enema. Mm-hmm. And that's sort of the truth about where we are. And so the idea that fundamentally you have, when you compare Democrats and Republicans, Democrats are it's like the doctor you go to, and the doctor's oh my God, you're losing so much weight. You've never been better. And you're I don't know why I'm losing weight. And the doctor's I don't know why either. But it's really one of the premier signs of good health, go out, play some tennis, and you go to the Republican doctor and he's I've seen this before, you have cancer. It's cancer. It's weight loss from cancer. It's cachexia is what it's called. Very serious condition. Fortunately, I've got my own, house branded aspirin. It's aspirin with some vitamins that I'll sell you. Take care of your cancer right away. No problem. And you're just like, where's the chemo doctor? And like the chemo doctor is basically not there. And I'm like, all right, I think it's a situation for chemo. I don't think it's a hospice situation at this point. But like, basically, you don't really want to wait 2 weeks with that shit, and like, I'm like, actually, and you've been doing this thing of like, you have this weird ass symptom and you're just ignoring it for like months or years. And like, it's not stage 1. And like, actually, like, that's the reality that American conservatives have to realize, is that they've been complicit in their own destruction, in their own societal destruction, in a way that's really like kind of personally sinful. Like, they really actually need to atone for what they've allowed to have happen, because a lot of that feeling of like, oh, we have the best system of government in the world, so I can just watch like Clemson versus Notre Dame, right? It's just like, actually, like, there's something that's not just ignorance. There's something like actually like deeply culpable in that. And, somebody has to tell these people, like, hey, like, you need to have literally a come to Jesus moment on this, because like, I don't think Jesus would regard this the way you think he would, and like,
but we're faced with a country that doesn't want their hair to fall out.
Yes, we're faced with a country that doesn't want their hair to fall out. And I'm like, your hair is going to fall out one way or another.
It's going to fall out.
It's going to fall out. And it's like, actually, no, like, you actually have a chance to, like, I mean, if the whole, like, I mean, here, let's close with this. So, there's what was really remarkable, and I hope is not lost, with the martyrdom of Charlie, who did one of the best interviews of me that I think has ever been done, among many other amazing achievements, is it wasn't really the actions of this one crazy person that was remarkable. It was the way people responded to it on the left, because there were like 3 people who were like clearly responded in a like sincere way, one of them being Cenk fucking Uygur, right? And like, everyone else is like, yeah, but like, well, he's very divisive. Like, and people on the right are just like, there's just no way I would have responded that way in the other direction. Somebody shoots some like, white nationalist shoots Barack Obama. I'm not going to be like, well, like, yeah, you shouldn't do that. But like, you got to recognize that DEI is really unfair. And like, nobody's going to respond that way. Right. Nobody, either you or I know, would ever think of responding that way. And nor should we. That is not our business. That is not like, we need to be strong in in different ways than that. And basically conservatives looked at that and they're just like, yeah, wow, what if the good cop is actually the bad cop? What if like it's just like the cops? What if like Mutt and Jeff like go out for drinks every day after the office? Like, what if liberalism and communism and progressivism and socialism and anti-racism and is just one thing?
It's all one thing.
It's all one thing. Like Occam's razor. Like, forget your like two lefts theory. Like, oh yes, the Hamas is military and the political wing. Oh, we'll make a deal with the political wing and they'll something. Like, no, just stop. This is cope, right? There's one thing, right? And like, to realize that, there's an interesting sort of historical analogy now. I do not believe that we're headed for a literal civil war simply because I don't think on either side we frankly have the balls. I think most gun-owning conservatives have never shot at a human being, never would. And even if they're military veterans, sort of, that's the same result. As for the testosterone levels of, of liberals, you'll find more in an unmarried young koala girl, and like, so actually we can't actually have a civil war in that sense, but it's like very existential. And it reminds us of the original Civil War. And the thing about the original Civil War, or the American Civil War, not actually the original, is that basically the leaders of 1861 in the Confederacy were actually the Southern moderates. So, Jefferson Davis is found arguing very strongly against secession in 1850 when it might well have worked. And by 1860, it was pretty sealed in a way. And what really kicked off and forced sort of almost swing states like Virginia to basically side with the Confederates. I mean, the radical fire eaters were never in charge, but like Virginia looks at John Brown and they're like, oh, this guy was just a nut. And then he looks at this huge outpouring of support for John Brown in the North among people who really want them to be slaughtered in their beds, Haiti style, and would cheer if that happened. And they're like, we can't do this. Right, that was kind of their divorce moment, and it came too late. And so when Americans look at the fact that, basically, most liberals would not have done this, but they're pretty sympathetic with it. You're just like, wait a second, this is one thing. Right. And we've been sort of played with this good cop, bad cop act, for 100 years, and we can't do that anymore. And how does actually our strategy change when we forget this stupid thing of let's try to, basically you're being interrogated in the police station and you're like, God, the bad cop is so bad. What if we can get him fired? What if he's breaking the law clearly? I'm going to petition Jeff and tell Jeff all about how Mutt is being a terrible cop, and Jeff will be like, yeah, I'm going to file a personnel dispute, against Mutt, right? And you're just like, no.
It's the same guy.
It's the same guy in a different costume, and maybe it's literally the same guy. And so, this idea that you can say, okay, our problem is this fringe, and what is the center of gravity of Antifa? Actually, whatever the center of gravity of Antifa is, it is not the center of gravity of the left. And so you are actually basically being that whole misperception of the situation is basically making you punch the other guy's boxing glove instead of his neck.
Yeah.
And
political three-card Monty.
A little political three-card Monty, and he's certainly out for your neck. And say what you want about the Civil War or whatever you want to call it. Obviously, there's a lot of different perspectives on that. But, just objectively, in terms of ought rather than is, or is rather than ought, there's something that's really worth noting about that struggle, which is that there's a very, there's a very strong asymmetry of aims. Because the North is in the grips of this thing called the slave power conspiracy. They really believe that Richmond and Charleston and Jackson want to impose slavery in Massachusetts and maybe even Maine. And the soil will be tilled by gangs of slaves and free white labor will have to perish. I don't know, something. Right. And so there's and they're just whether you're an abolitionist or an anti-slavery man, you're horrified by that. You really believe it. It's as fake as the international Jewish conspiracy. Actually, the South has no interest whatsoever how these goddamn Puritans govern themselves. It's just you want to ban alcohol, polygamy, slavery, ban everything. I don't know, I'm just you guys are weird. Just do your thing, right? But don't do your thing to us. The North has a very, very clear idea how Richmond and Charleston should be governed. Okay, that creates a very strong asymmetry because you have one side fighting to win and the other side fighting to not lose.
One side fighting to be left alone, and just leave me alone movements always lose.
That's right. And what happens in the American Civil War, I love explaining this to Europeans because they have much more open minds, is that the South sort of has this perspective where they're basically they're just doing 1776 all over again, or maybe even 1688. They're actually standing up for freedom. They said, hey, when they joined the Union, we have the right to leave. Now, the North is not exactly denying that they have the right to leave, but not giving them the right to leave, which is weird abusive behavior, all by itself. And so they're wow, we're being gaslighted. This is very fucked up. We gotta you're saying, oh, we don't have any right to keep you in the Union. And then we're saying, oh, yeah, we have some property issues to sort out. Oh, yeah, the property issues is we have this massive naval base in your chief harbor, but we're not, it's okay, we'll work it out. We're not going to reinforce it. Oh, yeah, we reinforced it, right? And the South, it's just like, man, like, how long can I let you piss down my neck and tell me it's raining? Right? So they're like, all right, this is over. We're doing this. Like, we're a nation. We have to establish ourselves these ways. We recognize that we have a much smaller industrial base. Don't even get me started on the whole like King Cotton plan. But you know what? We're men. We ride, we shoot, and one of us can whip any three of you, especially your like conscripted Irish immigrants, shuffling, whatever. And they're like, all right, we're independent. Bring it on. Try to coerce us. You've been denying for 30 years that you have the right to coerce a state to stay in the Union. Now you came with this Fort Sumter bullshit. All right, just fine. We know what you are. Come and get it. That's what they say to the North. And the North is like, we must preserve the Union and something, and they march an army across the Potomac. And what ensues is the first Battle of Bull Run or Manassas, if you're a Southerner, and the South is absolutely right. Proved completely right. They kick the North's ass. They send them fleeing in disorder. They're outnumbered. They're more manly. They know how to fight. Perfect vindication. And the South is like,
we got this.
God has spoken. They've vindicated us. We got this. We told you. Real shame about the loss of life. Like, why did you not listen to us? Like, did you not believe us? Like, did you think we were talking about our asses? Like this happened exactly like we said, right? So let's like make a peace deal and sort out these property issues, and we'll like live happily ever after and leave each other alone. At the time when they come up with this like brilliant line of bullshit, there are no organized Union forces between the Army of Northern Virginia and Washington, D.C., or Boston, or Toronto, or probably the North fucking Pole, right? And they're just like...
March to Mexico City, man.
Yeah, they could, take Mexico City while they're at it, right? But actually they just wanted to be left alone.
They wanted to be left alone.
They just wanted to be left alone. They just wanted to grill. And they did not have a telos. They did not have a picture of the world that they were creating that was so big that it would even include their defeated enemies. If you know the line in Virgil about the mission of Rome, to humble the proud and spare the conquered, what is it, something like that, where they're like, the Sibyl says to Aeneas, like, your mission is to govern, right? And like basically when the Romans beat somebody, he would be like, the early Romans, he would be like, all right, I'm bequeathing my kingdom to Rome. Everyone will be like Roman, not citizens, but like, affiliates or whatever they called them. And like, you know what, we're not going to have politics anymore. Rome will take care of it. And Rome was very happy with that deal. But like, this situation of like, we're fighting to be left alone. I'm like, no, actually, like, if you want to win, you have to have a theory of how to govern the libs.
Yeah, because in reality, that continent needed to be filled up anyway. So being left alone...
It was going to happen.
It was going to happen.
It was going to happen, right? And the thing is, the most enlightened and radical of the Southern thinkers, people like George Fitzhugh, understood that basically the fight of the Confederacy was or should be basically to repeal the French Revolution. But actually, fundamentally, sort of like the woke right-believing people, fundamentally, the people who were running the Confederacy actually believed that they were on the left. And they were just not operating in reality, to say nothing of like, we're going to embargo our own chief export so that we can't afford to buy guns or anything, because what are we fighting a war, right? There was that, right? That was like really spectacular. There's a wonderful book by a Virginia historian named Sheldon Van Auken called The Glittering Illusion, that is about basically the like reasons why the South lost because of its just an inability to perceive reality and operate in reality. And I just don't think we can afford that mistake.
All right, Curtis Yarvin, thank you.
Thank
Ron
you so
Dodson,
much.
Thank you very much. Appreciate
Amazing pleasure.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the New Founding Podcast. New Founding has become a rallying point for founders and investors who are taking serious bets in the face of a stagnant business culture. Our venture fund backs early-stage startups focused on critical civilizational problems. If you're interested in pitching your company or investing in our fund, check out newfounding.com/venture and follow the link to apply. You can also follow us on X, @newfounding, and @NAT, Halberstadt, HALBERSTADT.